Hello and welcome to the Pharma podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. I am joined today by Rob DiCicco from TransCelerate Biopharma. It's a nonprofit that brings together pharma companies in the industry and the FDA to improve clinical trials. And they've recently completed a major meeting towards that end and released a report about that meeting that was held at the end of last year. We'll link to the report in the show notes, but we're going to try to give you the highlights and a little bit about the work that TransCelerate's been doing today. Welcome to the show, Rob. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Jonah. I'm very excited to be here.
So, really quick before we start, tell me a little bit about yourself and about TransCelerate and how you got to where you are today.
Way back when I was working for one of the founding companies of TransCelerate, which was GlaxoSmithKline at the time, and had actually led one of their early flagship programs, represented GSK on their oversight committee. And over time, have stayed involved. I moved on from GSK, spent a little bit of time at IBM Watson Health in their life sciences business, and then rejoined TransCelerate as one of their portfolio heads in late 2021. About 2 years ago, we really revamped our portfolio, and we are aiming ourselves at a North Star, which really wants to bring the convergence of clinical care and clinical research, meaning how can you use information that's collected at the point of care to answer regulatory questions and to answer questions that informs patient care and helps physicians make decisions. Of that, one of our most important programs is this embedded pragmatic trials, which is meant to really enable the ability to scale up or industrialize uh, research at the point of care.
This term pragmatic trials, I'm not familiar with it. Is it related to sort of like decentralized trials, hybrid trials? What does it mean and why use that term over other terms?
So what you will find in your if you had all the time in the world to research this is that the term has been around since the late 60s. That's probably the last place that most people will agree on what is and what is not for pragmatic trials. So where the disagreement lies is where is their utility and how they can be used. We would like to pursue expanding the scalability of being able to use them to not only inform clinical practice, which where they have been primarily utilized, but we'd also like to be able to use them to answer research questions that lead to product labeling, new indications, informing what goes into the label. So basically, regulatory decisions. There are places in the world where they're viewed primarily to be used for generating comparative effectiveness through observational trials or non interventional studies.
What is it? But like, what is a pragmatic trial? Is it different than a clinical trial? Does it not go through your standard clinical trial organization and all of that?
So there are two primary features of how they're different to what people are accustomed to when they think of an industry sponsored randomized controlled trial. One is that generally, if you want to use this information for comparative effectiveness or you want to use it for answering a regulatory question or getting a new claim in your label, you're generally talking about a portfolio of medicines that have a fair amount of information behind them. So maybe the drug is already on the market for one indication, but you really want to examine its utility for another indication. You see this in oncology all the time in the way indications are sequenced, for example. Um, so that's one way that they differ from something that is in an early phase 2 trial or is in its first phase 3 trial, where there's still not a lot of tremendous information, and you're still learning a lot about the safety and the effect and the efficacy of the drug. In most cases, we're talking about medicines where safety and efficacy have at least been proven for one use. So the setting, I guess I would say, is one differentiating feature. The other differentiating feature is because all of that information has already been generated. Safety is well characterized. Pharmacology, pharmacokinetics is well characterized. There is this opportunity to, one, simplify the design of the trial and the number of different procedures that you require patients and investigators to go through to complete the study. And then the second is a simplification of the eligibility criteria. So there's this opportunity to launch a trial or design a trial with much broader um, eligibility criteria, which really improves the representativeness of the data that you're generating for the population that you want to market the product for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So there's a connection here to kind of the conversation about real world evidence, about wider data sets and more flexible data sets in research and practice.
There certainly are. And in your original question, you asked how do some of these compare to decentralized trials, hybrid trials, etc. There are many features that are the same. So if you could solve for the barriers that are involved in the operational delivery and the design of pragmatic trials, you could also solve for some of the same barriers and operational challenges that you encounter when you're trying to implement decentralized or hybrid trials. So some of that sits in the space where you need a different way to deliver one of the operational components. Maybe it's the data acquisition, or maybe it's the monitoring of data integrity, or maybe it's the qualification and training of investigators. There are ways that you'll have to do that very differently in a decentralized setting and a pragmatic setting than you might do in an early randomized controlled trial.
So I appreciate that background, and I think it's going to help us as we go into the rest of the conversation. But I definitely want to hear about this meeting from December. Briefly, who was there? What were the objectives, and what did you come away from it with? What were the key takeaways in the report?
So I think the process in and of itself was unique because Cedar's C3TI, their innovation team, actually facilitated bringing a very, very collaborative cross agency point of view to the table, meaning that there were people at the table that sat in the policy space. They sat in the review divisions, different functions in the review divisions. They sat in the inspectorate. So, that part of the agency that really comes in during and at the end of a study to sort of assure the quality of the study conduct and assure certain elements of the data. Having all of those people at the table at the same time created an ability to have a different kind of conversation versus having them individually with each one alone, where you may not understand where the tensions are or the tensions lie or the disagreements might lie in terms of one approach versus another approach. So this robustness and the efficiency of actually having it all in one place was very unique. You can sort of rinse and repeat that. This was a hypothetical exercise. We developed a hypothetical case study for it, a hypothetical trial, and a setting where a drug had already been approved for one indication, and we were looking to study it for a second indication. So there was really no risk involved, but it kind of gave you a window into what kind of engagement you could have with FDA when you were going live with a pragmatic study with a real medicine, with real patients, for example. We used that hypothetical case study to generate, selected topics of interest where we believe there are a lot of pain points in terms of being able to do this at scale. Some of them are related to how you pick an endpoint, or how do you select the design or certain elements of design, like being blinded or randomized, etc. We covered elements of data acquisition and how you assure data quality. Um, we covered different elements of data privacy. So you talked about the importance that is being placed on real world data. In a pragmatic setting, there's this opportunity to collect data straight from the electronic health record. The technology piece is one aspect of that. The other aspect is making sure that you stay within the lines with respect to data privacy law. And those laws are very different regionally and globally. And most of our membership at TransCelerate run global clinical trials. So those are some of the key features that we were able to tee up in the first exercise. We had never done anything like this. I'm not sure that the agency had ever done anything like this before, but we were able to come out with a summary that really gives you clarity around at least three areas of risk: data acquisition, study design, and endpoint selection, etc. It also gave you some insight into certain aspects of that study design, like randomization. like blinding and so forth. I think we all agree that it was very successful, and we've actually teed up a future workshop to repeat that for another part of the value chain. So, how do we look at safety acquisition for a mature asset? Might be a topic of conversation for a future workshop that we have.
And how does it help sort of that you've got FDA in the room, you've got industry in the room? I mean, when you come out with these recommendations, these frameworks, you pretty much have the buy-in of everyone you need, right? Or are there other, is there a, any evangelizing that needs to happen?
So in this instance, in this workshop setting, it's non-binding, right? These are hypothetical case studies, but they do give you this window into what it could look like. So, for example, we went forward with a study design which was unblinded, but the agency gave us clarity and helped educate us on what does that mean when you're taking an endpoint that is not a hard endpoint. So, what's the difference between a hard endpoint and a soft endpoint? Hard endpoint might be something that you could just measure in a lab, blood glucose or hemoglobin A1C for a diabetes assessment. The number is the number. It's immutable what that number is. Um, Other softer endpoints might be something that sits within a rating scale where you could have this influence of the investigator or the patient or whoever's helping the patient answer the questions. Those are validated rating scales, but if it's not blinded, the validity of some of those things really changes. And so just giving an industry guidance that helps them not spin their wheels to go back to the agency in a real setting with a real trial where your endpoint selection is not going to match up with the kind of design that you're putting on the table. It also really helped in terms of getting alignment where the review division understands why you're doing something a certain way. Like, let's talk about how we assure the quality of the data. The ability to monitor data collection and do data validation in an environment where somebody is entering the data into a platform that was specifically designed to be able to capture that information for a trial is very different than coming up with some sort of programmatic way of transferring that data or transmitting that data via program directly out of an electronic health record. Study monitors, sponsor organizations, we don't have access to those things. There are data privacy laws which prohibit access to those things. And so we have to brainstorm around how can we achieve the same level of data quality by some other mechanism without inadvertently introducing some element of risk. And so to have people from the inspector's office, the Office of Scientific Investigation at the table to inform some of that conversation um, was huge. And I guess the last piece I would say is none of these things are done in isolation, or they're not done necessarily in a vacuum. And so, in addition to some of the recommendations that have been put out around pragmatic trials, there are also recommendations around how you implement quality by design in your programs, and those are part and parcel in trying to do this and do it in a quality way. And so, one recommendation actually informs the other, if you will.
So I think you talked about this a little bit, but what happens next? Now that you've had the meeting, you've put this report out. What are the next steps?
From a strictly TransCelerate point of view, I'll speak about that first. One is to continue to educate and socialize this with our membership. So as they're thinking through their study planning, they can incorporate some of the learning from this and some of the insights from this. The other is to work collaboratively with the agency to socialize this information more broadly than just TransCelerate member companies. So one of the things that is a feel good for me about TransCelerate is that with very few exceptions, all of our offerings are publicly available, and so the ability to sort of inform the broader ecosystem is of tremendous value for us. I think the second piece is to continue a dialogue with the FDA about other aspects of the life cycle of a study that are ripe for introducing pragmatic elements. For example, selected safety data collection would be one. And then the logical piece in reference to a comment that I made earlier is our membership, our global companies, is to try to invite and find common ground with other health authorities outside the US and continue to sort of socialize this concept. If you think back to what happened during the pandemic in terms of how some of those vaccines and antivirals were developed, many of them had pragmatic components built into them. And so trying to figure out what worked, what didn't work, and what can be industrialized and what could be scaled, are there's sort of like this trail of breadcrumbs that have been left for us to try to put together in some way that actually helps sponsor organizations, investigators, regulators try to bring this into the mainstream somewhat.
I mean, that's an interesting point about, outside the United States. I mean, is TransCelerate a very U.S. centric organization, or are the goals larger than that? I know that all of the pharma companies you work with are global pharma companies in one sense or another.
No, I think by definition, we have to be focused globally. We do have to understand. Uh, we have to understand the regional differences across the globe as we're developing and designing solutions to make sure that they scale. So it would be very difficult to have our member companies or any sponsor organization have to do things five different ways or try to implement a solution five different ways to satisfy five different health authorities. So a lot of that is baked in. We put a lot of infrastructure behind that. There are senior regulatory affairs individuals that make up what we call the Regulatory Affairs Council at TransCelerate and help us manage those relationships and those conversations with key regulatory authorities across the globe. They also advise the project teams at TransCelerate in terms of how to ask the right questions of a health authority and how to frame the conversation in a way where there's mutual benefit to come to the table, where there's mutual incentive, and really understanding what the areas of focus are for any one health authority in some region of the world.
The sort of, I guess, elephant in the room here for me is this meeting was held at the end of 2024. And then at the beginning of 2025, the US government changed dramatically. And as the years gone on, HHS and FDA certainly were part of that change. Were most of the government folks that were in the room, are they still at those posts? Is the thinking on this sort of, is there continuity into the new regime, or is that still an open question?
So the people on the point from Cedars um, uh, Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, they are the same folks, right? Some of the folks in the review division have changed, but I also know that some of the people in the policy division have changed, and some of them are the same. I haven't done a scorecard. What I can tell you is that this continues to be an area of high priority, and I think that the summary of the first exercise at the end of 24 has is sort of set the table and established a relative degree of confidence and my surrogate for that is being invited back to do a 2.0 in the fall and tee up the safety conversation.
Yeah, it does seem to line up with the priorities of Macri's FDA, as I understand them, because he's all about, improving efficiency, utilizing technology smartly, and this seems, part and parcel with that.
We're hoping so.
What else is TransCelerate working on?
So over the past few years, our portfolio has been become more and more connected. So there is a piece of work that I'm closely involved with that is related to tackling the challenges that exist in terms of exchanging healthcare information for the very same purposes that we were talking about. Some of that is related to the technical challenge. So we're working very closely with standard setting organizations and different members of the technology community and a variety of different constructs. So we have some partnerships with those. Some of them were participants in the partners. Some of them we've set up. Um, uh, and through those partnerships, we are trying to tackle this issue of interoperability and making it more seamless to exchange information to answer research questions. The technology challenge is only part of the equation, and I have a lot of confidence that that piece will get solved for. I think the pieces that need more collaboration are one, areas of policy that may be unintentionally getting in the way of allowing the technology to do what it needs to do. The second piece is really creating a deeper understanding of how the implementation of a study design either fits or doesn't fit within the workflow of a healthcare system. And so if you look over years past and you look at studies that are your more quote unquote traditional randomized controlled phase 2 and early phase 3 trials, a lot of those are done exquisitely with the research question in mind, the primary objective, and the regulatory goalposts that people are trying to hit. It doesn't oftentimes consider the challenges of how patients flow through a healthcare system, the relative resource constraints around the healthcare system as it now exists, and that's globally. That's not just in the U.S. And so, trying to tackle some of those things are part and parcel of these other programs, not just the sexy techie aspects of it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Makes a lot of sense. What haven't we talked about yet that you think is important here as we think about the news, as we think, about the work that you guys are doing? Any other tidbits in the report that we haven't hit very hard?
I think the one that we haven't really talked about is the role that TransCelerate plays in sort of taking a recommendation or taking chunks of information and putting it into practice. And so, granted that I teed this up by starting with a conversation about the setting that these studies fit in, it may not represent uh, 80% of a sponsor's portfolio. Uh, However, given what we've said about the importance of generating data in a real world setting, taking advantage of data that exists in a real world setting, I think once you start to solve some of these problems on the technical side, on the policy side, on the partnership side, you start to open up avenues to other types of opportunities. And before I get a little bit more specific around that, I guess I wanted to put a punctuation on the first part of this part of the conversation about the importance of taking up and actually participating in demonstration projects that bring some of these solutions to life and these recommendations to life. If they sit on a shelf as a set of recommendations in a glossy binder somewhere, it's not really helping. So part of our ambition is to actually help people translate the assets that we've developed into implementation and into action. So that's one piece of it. If you look what's happening in the data science and the technology space, and people start to talk about things like using real world data to develop digital twins, using real world data to establish comparative cohorts or quote unquote external controls, solving for the data interoperability piece, solving for the data privacy piece, solving for the trust and transparency pieces on how the data is being used. If you could do that for pragmatic trials, you sort of laid the groundwork to a very different looking construct for conducting research studies.
Yeah, and are we starting to see that happen? Are we starting to see some of those trials in practice, seeing it in action out in the world?
I think it's too early. I think it's too early. I think people are starting to wrap their heads around what we've done, trying to understand how they could put it in play and understand whether or not it actually de-risks what they would like to be able to do. I am encouraged by the number of other groups besides TransCelerate that are working on this, right? So we are not the only game in town trying to advance this concept. Um, but I would say, part of our mission is to make sure that we work collaboratively with those organizations. So we're not necessarily duplicating effort, but we're actually creating some thrust, and that we're leveraging all the assets that have been developed. That's why we developed the resource guide that we recently published as well. It actually curates and puts all that information that as a collection of sort of how to tackle various elements and what to know when you're trying to get started with pragmatic trials, and puts them all in one place, puts them at the hands of the user, and starts to take them towards an implementation step. So there are groups like Milk and Faster Cures and CTTI and FTIA in Europe and others who are all trying to tackle this problem. And part of the, I think, part of the value that we hope to create is to not only deliver solutions under the TransCelerate brand, but also make sure that we are taking advantage of one another's work, um, not duplicating that work, and also making our work accessible so those groups can pick them up as well.
That's great. That's a great note to end on. A lot of folks working together, and you don't see those groups as competing with you. You see it as kind of a team effort.
Without question, this is a very complex issue across a very diverse group of stakeholders. We really have a lead in the sponsor domain. We have a long history of working with regulators. However, there is the patient domain, there is the investigator and health system domain, there is the policy domain, the governmental policy domain, right? And so I think that this is a problem that needs more heads, arms, legs, and brains around the table than less. I guess I would say.
Awesome. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate you coming to chat with us about this. And any takeaway messages for our listeners who are mostly going to be folks in the pharma industry if they're not involved in this work, if they're interested in getting involved in this work?
So I guess I would say that there are misconceptions, and you've pointed out a couple of them. One is that we are a U.S. based organization. I think we are encouraging sponsors of every ilk, whether you are a large pharma sponsor, a startup, an academic researcher who wants to sponsor a trial. There are exquisite examples of studies that have been launched in the last few years. One of them is called the pragmatic lung trial. I think that's a great blueprint for what might be done in this setting. The recovery trial, while not perfect, was another one that is an example of where some of the elements of both recovery and pragmatic lung are opportunities to start to drive pragmatic elements into your own study and find those features that work. So that aspect of really thinking about this on a global scale is one. And then the other to know, just from a pure TransCelerate point of view, we view this as a very open solution, and we do welcome other partners to come to the table with us and collaborate and take advantage of what we started and share what they've implemented.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate you joining us. And I'm sure folks have learned as much, folks listening have learned as much from this conversation as I have.
Thanks, Jonah. I appreciate your time and was happy to do it.
That concludes another episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments, at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your podcasts. Just search for Pharma Forum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit the website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at Pharma Forum. That's PharmaPhorum. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.